What's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast for Bama 24/7. I am Cody Goodwin. I'm here with Mike Rodak. We are glad you are here. Mike, I got a question for you to start this thing. It's week 0. We're recording this on a Friday. College game day is back tomorrow morning, which will lead to the Florida State-Georgia Tech game, which is being played in Dublin. That's exciting. American football continues to grow internationally. We've seen a few games now go to Dublin. I think we've seen a handful of other college football games get played internationally, including, but definitely not limited to, the Bahamas Bowl. If you got to pick the next international location for a college football game, where would you like to see it go next?
Toronto. I have actually covered an NFL game in Toronto. If you want to consider that international, it was about an hour drive from my house in Buffalo. Was up and back in the same day. So a little bit different than going to Dublin, but I just don't know if college football resonates outside of the United States nearly as much as the NFL. And obviously they're trying to make that happen. They're trying to piggyback on some of the interest that there is in the NFL with all the London games that they've had. And now the NFL is doing games in Germany and, Mexico, they've done a few times, and maybe expanding beyond that. But, why not start where it's easy in Canada? I do think there's some level of interest in college football in Canada. And that's probably an easier market to kind of assimilate into than trying to go into Spain or Portugal or France or the UK or Germany or anywhere. Why not start with something simpler to me? Maybe I'm not understanding the assignment, but Toronto I feel like is a decent place where they already know, CFL football. They already know NFL football. Why not try there? And maybe there's been games in Canada. I can't think off the top of my head recently, but that's where I would start.
That's the smart answer, because there are so many things that, like you mentioned, the CFL, that was the first thing that came to my mind. And Canada's obviously, we're neighbors. So I imagine that they pay pretty close attention to the NFL and they watch the Super Bowl every year. I was kind of hoping you'd pick somewhere over the ocean, though.
No.
My first thought was London, because I think, for as much as the NFL is really trying to grow the game internationally, London or the UK in general, huge soccer country, right? There's something like 100 different professional soccer clubs in the space of what is effectively the state of Ohio. I would feel like they would understand the passion and religious nature of college football maybe a little bit more than they would understand the NFL. I don't know. That's at least one thought. That's probably a bunch of conversations wrapped into one, but I don't know. I feel like it could do pretty well in London or somewhere in the UK. That's at least, I don't know, one man's opinion.
In college sports in general are not a thing in Europe. That's not something that is part of the sports scene. I mean, the football clubs are more independent, and then you play in high school and college independently of wherever you go for a university, and then you might play professionally. But there is college football in Canada, so let's not forget about that. I remember the University of Guelph in Ontario. That's where Thomas Dimitrov played. He used to be the general manager of the Atlanta Falcons. He played at Guelph.
I think there are a few actual NCAA programs in Canada, or perhaps also NAIA programs. There are collegiate athletic institutions in Canada.
It's called U Sports, and so there's 27 of them. Most of them are in Eastern Canada, but all of the universities they do play, and they're small stadiums. It's probably comparable to a D2 or D3 situation. There are some bigger ones that might play in a CFL stadium, but again, I think that's probably a better place to start if I'm the business major trying to figure this out. If I'm the football coach trying to figure it out too, I think that's a better place to go than having to pack up my team and make an expensive trip across the ocean. It's cool to see these games. I wonder if the novelty will wear off after a while. I don't I mean, Kalen DeBoer got asked about it this week, and I think he kind of gave the political answer of like, we'd think about it down the road. I mean, his schedule is already made. I don't think there's going to be games added to their schedule, especially in the 12-team playoff year. I don't think Alabama's too interested in playing an extra game in week 0. So I would highly doubt that happens. I think coaches, again, logistically don't love making those trips. And the bigger question is, does college football as a institution, does that move up? Do they move up their schedule? Because that's been a talk the last few years that week 0, as we know it now, with whatever it is, 3 games, could become week 1, where you're starting this week across all of college football. And then you have 2 weeks where you're not competing against the NFL, although you're still competing against the NFL preseason, which in some cases is not a fair fight because the NFL is still going to win. But I guess what they want to avoid is going up against the NFL in the playoffs. And if they can schedule things in December when there's not NFL games on Saturdays, then that's helpful. Then that's still a big problem. The NFL keeps expanding their footprint in terms of which days they have games in December. College football is expanding its footprint in December. But if you go head to head, the NFL is going to win 99.5 times out of 100.
Shield's impenetrable. So I don't envy the college football decision makers, but I don't know, like seeing the game go international. I guess I'm going to be curious about like what the reception is going to be this Saturday. I think there's a lot of people that are excited just for the fact that there's an actual legitimate college football game on TV. At least I know I am.
Sorry, there's a weird noise in my house, but I realized it was next door. It was like an alien noise. It was like, woo. Anyway, if college teams are trying to save money to there's your podcast title, an alien noise.
An alien noise in Mike's house.
Or the University of Guelph. That should be your other podcast title. To pay players. And I don't know like what the arrangement is in terms of travel. Whoever's Aer Lingus or whoever's sponsoring this game, like who's paying for their travel over there. But it just seems like it's expensive to make that sort of move when you can play a game in your backyard. And, that's probably where the playoff is headed too. Like, I don't know if bowl games are going to survive in terms of having them in the quarterfinals.
They won't. They won't. They can call them whatever they want to call them, but we're all going to call them the national quarterfinals. Like,
I think people are going to realize that it's a whole lot easier to play a game in your own stadium. That it's not like there's that many games in Bryant-Denny Stadium, like 8. Like, there's not that many games to begin with, so you might as well play a couple more in December if you can, and keep that money in your own city and the hotels and the restaurants and all that, instead of packing up and going to Dallas or Atlanta or LA or Tasmania or Western Cambodia. Like, what's the purpose of trying to play everywhere else and grow your brand when sometimes your fans, 99% of your fans, are in your own backyard?
As much as I would like to see more international games, that is a sound argument for maybe not. So we'll see what happens. I don't know. I'm excited to watch the game tomorrow. We're going to be talking on today's show, now that we finally can get into it, about Alabama football, of course. I think we've talked at length about this team enough, the roster, the questions that we have, the things we want to see this upcoming season. We're all ready for the actual games to arrive. We're away from the Crimson Tide season opener against Western Kentucky. What I wanted to do today, Mike, was take one more dive into this Alabama team, but we'll spark this discussion with some over-unders, not necessarily prop bets per se, but I took it upon myself to set some lines, to write out a handful of questions, and I'm going to bounce them off you and kind of see what you think. I gave Mike no warning on any of these numbers or facts or figures, so his reactions are going to be live for the world to see and hear, not live because we're only recording this. But we're going to go mostly position by position, not actually all the way through every single position group, but just some numbers that I think might be interesting / important to Alabama in the 2024 season. That, of course, means we're going to start with the quarterbacks. Jalen Milroe returns after throwing for 2,800 yards, 23 touchdowns last season, also ran for north of 800 when you adjust for sacks, scored 35 total touchdowns when you add in his rushing totals. Got 2 separate numbers here for you, Mike, to start with. If I set Jalen Milroe's season line at 3,500 pass yards and 40 total touchdowns, you going over or under?
And to say season, we're talking about the whole and caboodle? Like if they play 15 games, you're talking about that, or you're just talking about the first 12 games before an SEC championship? Are you including an SEC championship? Because that's what makes college football stats hard. And it's only going to get worse with the 12-team playoff. Like one team's playing 12 games, one team's playing 13, one team's playing 14, 15, 16, 17. Like they're just so all over the place. There's no standardized number of games. And so it makes some of the stat totals hard. That's just me complaining off the top here. But that sounds pretty high to me. I will say, I think, what was it? Last year, he was at 2,800 passing yards, 23 passing touchdowns, 12 rushing touchdowns. So that's 35.
Yeah.
What was your over-under on the total touchdowns?
For total touchdowns, we'll call it 40.5.
Yeah. I'm still going to take the under on that. And, part of that, I think, is I think the touchdowns are going to get spread out. We did the projections, the season predictions on our website, and it's like, who's going to score the most touchdowns? It could be a number of players. It could be Ryan Williams, could be Jeremy Bernard, could be Jam Miller, could be Justice Haynes, could be Jalen Milroe. It could get more spread out than it was last year, where Milroe actually, scored the most. He had 12 rushing touchdowns. I don't know if that will happen again. I still picked him to have the most, but maybe it's 9 or 10. And I think it's hard to get to 40. Like 40 is a pretty big number. 3,500 is a pretty big number for an offense that I think is going to try to run the ball still. So I think he has more than what he had last year, but I'm still going to go with the under, 3,236, somewhere in that range.
I landed on these numbers. I'll tell you how I formulated this. I'm obviously of the belief that I think the offensive brain trust is going to really help Milroe out this year. He threw for just under 3,000 yards last year and scored 35 total touchdowns while also missing a game. I'm not saying that he would have made up the difference between 2,800 and 3,500 if he would have played against South Florida, but I think there's a chance he may have hit 40 total touchdowns. That said, that was also earlier in the season when the offense was very much in flux and he wasn't nearly as confident as he was playing in the latter half of the season. So who knows? But I think just like the combination of those two thoughts, that he's got a better offensive brain trust and he's going to be a lot more confident coming into this season. I felt like that's where those numbers could potentially land. That said, I think the under on the pass yards, the under on the total touchdowns, I think is kind of interesting because I think there's going to be an opportunity there for him to probably hit like 30 and 10 if he has a really, really good season. But the under on the pass yardage, I'm not sure that I'm super surprised by that, just because, like you said, really good running back room. Milroe obviously is a threat to run the ball. That seems to be what they are going to lean into, at least early in the season, or at least all indications suggest that they should. So,
and obviously we're counting, even though we're not counting the South Florida game last year because he didn't play, we are counting the Rose Bowl. Not that he had 0 touchdowns and 116 yards in that game, but like, again, if we're counting potential playoff games, like you could have a first round playoff game, you could have a quarterfinal. If they win that, you could have a semifinal. Like you're adding more potential games to his total. Yeah, then I think he can certainly hit those numbers if they get that far. But if we're kind of limiting it to your 12 regular season games plus potential SEC championship game as 13 total games, I think those numbers are probably on the higher side for me.
That tracks. If another number to maybe keep in track, he averaged 218 pass yards per game last year. If you extrapolate that out to a 14th game, he surpasses 3,000 passing yards. So one data point to consider. Same thing if you go with his touchdown average. I think he averaged like 2.7 touchdowns per game. You extrapolate that over a 14th game, he hits roughly 37, 38 total touchdowns last season. So just something to keep in mind. I don't know. Maybe I'm a little bit optimistic. That's probably the case here, but the fact that you took the under on total pass yards maybe doesn't surprise me all that much just because of the makeup of the offense, which leads us to the running back room, arguably pound for pound the most talented position group on the offense with Justice Haynes, Jam Miller, Richard Young. We talked about Milroe's threat to run the ball as well. Probably the best running back room Kalen DeBoer has ever had throughout his coaching tenure. The question I pose to you, Mike, will Alabama as a team have 2,000 rushing yards this season?
See, some of these total stats, I need to look back for context because, like, off the top of my head, I can't tell you if they did last year or not.
They did.
Yeah, but it wasn't like wasn't the most impressive 2,000 yards I've ever seen, right?
No, it was a slog.
Right. They had 2,400. Yeah, I'm going to go with yes. I think they'll hit 2,000 this year. And he only averaged 4.3 last year, which wasn't great. I think it was actually one of the lowest of this the Saban era at that time. It's now the DeBoer era. So yeah, I think I would take the over on that potentially pretty easily. I think this could be a better rushing team than last year. I think it could be a team that relies heavily on the rush. So yeah, that's where I'm at on that one. I don't know if I have a deep, in-depth answer, but I think 2,000 is very attainable when you have two backs, and Miller and Haynes that could both be in the 800-900 yard category pretty easily, and then you had Milrow in and Richard Young in some games, and I think they'll get there.
I agree. I think 2K seems like an easy bar to clear for this team, just given the makeup of the personnel, and also, again, I've been playing the EA CFB game. When you decide to run duo or inside zone with Alabama, that interior offensive line is a cheat code. You get 5 yards down the field before you get hit by an opposing defender. I'm not saying that's what it's going to feel like in real life, but it could be if everybody stays healthy. One other data point I wanted to point out and consider, if you look back at the last 5 years of Kalen DeBoer's offense, that's 2 years at Washington, 2 years at Fresno State, and then that 2019 season at Indiana, none of those teams actually ran for 2,000 total yards. They were pretty pass heavy. They had Michael Penix Jr., Peyton Ramsey at Indiana. Penix was also at Washington the last couple years. And even though they had pretty good dual threat running back room at Fresno State, they also had Jay Kaner, who was throwing the ball around the yard. It'll be interesting to see what that balance is like. They did have Dylan Johnson, who was a 1,000-yard rusher last year. I believe he finished second rushing in the Pac-12 at Washington. But as a collective team, none of DeBoer's offenses the last 5 years have hit 2,000 yards, which is what made me kind of curious. Like, okay, he's got the personnel to probably do it this year. Will they?
Yeah, and I mean, Penix was pushing 40 passes a game last year. He had 555 attempts, and what did Washington play? 15 games. So they would have played, Pac-12 and then 2 playoff games. So I don't know if Jalen Milrow is going to be pushing 40 passing attempts per game. I don't think that's the best way for this team to win. So it could be a little bit lower. And I think that naturally kind of gives your offense an opportunity to run the ball more. And that could include Milrow running the ball more. First and second read's not there. He's probably going to take off more than some of the quarterbacks that Kalen's had in the past.
I agree with that. So if we believe Alabama's going to surpass 2,000 rushing yards, will they have an individual 1,000-yard rusher, something they haven't had in a couple years?
I don't think they necessarily need to get to 2,000. I think they could. I think if they do, it probably won't be by much. Like, I don't think it will be Najee Harris, who was at 2020, he was at almost 1,500 yards. Brian Robinson a couple years ago was at 1,200. I don't think they'll have that because I think there's going to be more of a balance between Miller and Haynes. But again, I think both of Miller and Haynes can get up into the 800, maybe 900 range. Which is really good. That would be really healthy for him. And maybe one has a little bit more of a split than the other. I personally picked Haynes, for our predictions, and maybe he gets to 900 and Miller's at 780 or something. I don't know. I would lean towards no in terms of them having a 1,000-yard rusher, but I don't think it would be out of the question for them to have a guy who gets into the low thousands or 1,100 or something like that.
The thing to note about last year's Washington team, Dylan Johnson was more or less the bell cow for them out of the backfield. They don't need to have a guy like that because of the depth. You mentioned Haynes, you mentioned Miller. Milrow's obviously a threat to run. Also, Richard Young has been fairly impressive both in spring ball and I think through fall camp as well in a couple of scrimmages. So he could be an option in maybe, like the Mercer game, for example, if you really want to give Haynes and Miller, not a week off, but a week off, you can let Richard Young take, 20, 25 carries that game. That allows Haynes and Miller to kind of rest up before the final 2 games and then whatever the postseason push looks like. So I agree. I don't think they need one, but I'm curious if you thought that they would have one this year. The receiver room, this is an interesting stat that I discovered before fall camp started. Since 2015, Alabama's had 5 receivers produce 7 1,000-yard seasons. In that same time span, Jamarcus Shepard, Alabama's new receivers coach, has coached 6 receivers to 8 1,000-yard seasons. Thought that was interesting. Will Alabama have a 1,000-yard receiver this season?
I think it's possible. I don't know if I would come out right now and say yes, just because I think there's too much unknown among those top 3, 4, 5 receivers for me to really get behind one guy to have it be a 1,000-yard situation. If someone does get there, I'm actually going to lean towards Ryan Williams over Jeremy Bernard. You can sign me up for the Ryan Williams train. I think they're going to go for it with him. I don't think they're going to be holding him back. So that, just based on his talent and his readiness, if you will, I think that puts him in the driver's seat to be that sort of guy. But again, you have him, you have Bernard, you have Prentice, you have Law, you have Henderson, you have Adams, you have Odom. I don't know if they do rotate some guys, especially early in the season. You trying to go through 5 or 6 receivers per game, like it's going to be tough for one guy to really stand out and get the amount of looks and catches that it's going to take for you to get to 1,000 yards. I don't think this is Devontae Smith 2020 territory where you can just throw it up to one guy every play. And I don't know if they have the quarterback for that, quite frankly. I don't think that's Jalen Monroe's strong suit to be throwing the ball 35, 40 times a game. So again, I would probably lean towards no, but I think it's possible. And I think if it does happen, I would pick Ryan Williams as the guy.
I think that's fair. The personnel that they had at Washington, we keep leaning on that because that was the last time we saw Kalen DeBoer's offense in action. You obviously had Michael Penix. You had 3 receivers that were ultimately taken in the top 100 of the NFL draft. So naturally, they're going to throw the ball 35, 40 times a game. Like, it just makes sense personnel-wise. I don't know if it makes sense to do that again with this particular roster. That said, the Ryan Williams pick is interesting. I'm curious, as a huge Cole Adams guy, what has kind of prompted you, Mike, to really lean all the way in on Ryan Williams? You seem to be all in on him popping this season.
I would say that I always cautioned against, expecting too much too soon with him, but because you just don't know when a guy comes in how he's going to look. And Keon Keeley last summer, for instance, came in, was not ready, and did not play last year. Single snap. Might not play very much this year either. But when a guy comes in, you can just tell. And I think that's even something I asked Tyler Booker at media days, just about, summer workouts and when you can tell a freshman's ready. He says, you can just tell, you can see it. You can't really fake it. And so I think the fact that he's gotten the praise that he has, and all indications are that he hasn't faked it and he's come in and looked the part, would give me confidence that he can play right away. And it's also a position where, it's not like a freshman quarterback where I think you have to be worried about confidence and decision-making. And is he going to get rattled? And I don't know if those things apply quite as much to a wide receiver. You're going out there and you're running your routes and getting open and catching the ball. And maybe you can get in your head about drops, but as long as you're blocking and being physical and being in the right spot, not having mental mistakes with penalties, which again, I think he's, by all indications, has avoided, then there's no reason to hold him back and slow play him at that position, just because it's not, quite frankly, as mental of a position as quarterback. And you don't have to worry about some of the same things you would as a quarterback. So why not is really my question. But in terms of the Cole Adams thing, I think you can have both of them out there. Why not have Ryan Williams and Cole Adams and Jeremy Bernard on your field as your top 3? I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm not saying it's not going to happen.
The primary guy that I think would keep Cole Adams off the field, Kobe Prentice. Kalen DeBoer was very complimentary about him when we talked to him, what would have been yesterday at the time that we're recording this, saying that this is a guy, Kobe brings speed. This is the exact quote from DeBoer. He's got some experience. He fits well with the offense. He can play inside and outside. That's something we're trying to groom all of our receivers to do, to be versatile. And that's an area where he's grown his game through the fall. When he gets in space and someone is one-on-one with him, there's very few people who can keep up. That kind of tracks with what maybe we've seen. And I know, even John Talty, who was with us here last year, now he's doing a lot bigger stuff with CBS and 24/7 National this season. Even he, during games last season, when Prentice would get the ball, he was very much get this guy the ball a little bit more. And so maybe Prentice's ability to play multiple receiver positions will allow Cole Adams to step into the slot. We can spend a whole podcast breaking down the receiver room and who we think the starters should be, who we think the primary guys should be that will play each week. And I think that's just what makes this position group so intriguing. And there's enough bodies in this room where I think the ball could be spread around enough that maybe I don't know that they need 1,000-yard receiver this year. I'm just curious if we think that there will be one. And the second part of that question that I had written down is, if so, who do you think it will be? Your answer was Ryan Williams. I tend to think probably Jeremy Bernard. That seems like it's the easy answer just because he knows the offense so well, and he's coming in as kind of the de facto leader, and I think he's probably going to be. Milroe hinted that he may already have a favorite target. It could very well be Ryan Williams. I think it's probably Jeremy Bernard if I had to guess. And, we'll find out over the next few weeks, right, when they actually start playing games and we see how this whole thing looks. But
I think that we should just talk the rest of the fall about what could happen. I didn't realize they're actually playing games. I thought we just talk for a living and we just do more and more weeks of this. We go out through September and talk about what could happen and how much this guy might play, and we get paid to do it every day. It's not a bad gig, I guess. But yeah, it's nice that they actually have a game coming up. It feels like we've been talking about this stuff since the spring. I mean, heck, you're talking about it the day they hired Kalen DeBoer, and we're talking about what it means for Jalen Milroe and the offense. And I want to say I'm tired of talking about it because this is what we do. But we'll just have to see. And it's like, all right, like, yeah, this guy deserves more looks at receiver. Caleb Odom because he's tall, and Kendrick Law because he bench presses, and Emmanuel Henderson because he's a 5-star prospect, and Kobe Prentice because he made a couple big plays last year, and Ryan Williams and Jeremy Bernard and Cole Adams because he's reliable. And they're not going to play 7 wide receivers. Like, it's just not going to happen. So I am interested myself to see who actually plays the most at receiver and who gets passes. And if they get passes, do they catch them, and how that all looks. Because look, I mean, this receiver position, and it's not the same room, the last couple of years has not looked great. And there's been talk, I remember scrimmages where Shaz Preston was going off and Prentice was going off and Law was going off. And you had Isaiah Bond, you had Jermaine Burton, and you had Malik Benson coming in as a JUCO transfer. He's going to be a big play threat. And at the end of the day, like, they just weren't that good at receiver. Like, Burton had his big game against A&M. He had a couple other big games, and Bond had his big catch against Auburn. At the end of the day, they just weren't anything near what they needed to be a national championship sort of wide receiver room. And Washington had those guys last year. I don't know if this team, even 2024, has those guys that Washington had last year. So, again, I think Williams can be in that category. I don't think he's going to be Rome Odunze right away, maybe in a year or two, but I still think you should play him. But yeah, overall, the room is just wait and see, and we're just going to have to see how it all shakes out and looks.
2 final thoughts on the receiver room before we tie a bow on this one. One, if you guys didn't hear that in Mike's voice, get this man a football game as soon as possible. He needs to watch something.
Everybody needs it. Everybody needs it. I mean, it's just, this is the worst time of the year where it's just like, all right, we've been talking about this stuff for 8 months now, and let's actually see it in action.
Second thing to tie a bow on this, I am of the belief that there is talent in this room. I'm also of the belief that a guy like Jamarcus Shepard and the offense that DeBoer brought with him will help, raise the level of the room, or at least raise the overall production and the output. Whether or not that translates to a 1,000-yard receiver or just more competence as a whole coming out of the position room, I think remains to be seen. But I am of the belief that these guys will play better, and obviously they're going to have a role in the offense. So how much better? We'll find out in 8 days, or at least we'll see the first step of this thing in 8 days. The offensive line for Alabama has not been fairly good in recent years. They've allowed 40-plus sacks in 2 of the last 3 seasons. Just hasn't been very good, which is crazy when you think about the talent level and just the number of 4- and 5-star guys that are in Alabama's offensive line room year after year after year. Kalen DeBoer's offense, the offensive line has played significantly better at Washington, at Fresno. I think they're the only truly bad season when you look back at the last 4 seasons when Kalen DeBoer's been the head coach has been the COVID adjusted season at Fresno State, right? I think they allowed 24 sacks in 6 games or something like that. Part of that, obviously, is he had Ryan Grubb on his staff all 4 seasons, who has an offensive line background. He served as a run game coordinator, just very, very adept at that position. At Washington specifically, the last couple of years, he had Scott Huff, very, very good offensive line coach. Washington won the Joe Moore Award last year. If I set the line for Alabama this year at 30.5 sacks allowed, do you think they allow more or do you think they allow less?
I'll actually take the under because I think, again, I think Kalen DeBoer is going to be, or is smart enough, I don't know what the right phrasing is there, that he will try to avoid those sort of situations, whether it's running the ball or getting rid of the ball quickly. And I do think he's going to coach Jalen Milroe into taking fewer sacks, because that was an issue for him last year. That was something Jalen Milroe himself has admitted. The quarterback is responsible for a lot of his sacks. I think Nick Saban hinted at that several times last year, that you can't always blame the offensive line for the high sack numbers, and that certainly was true in a lot of cases. I do think they have a coach that can help in that regard. The offensive line question is going to be different, just because, like, you have Chris Kapilovic coming in, and he hasn't worked with Kalen DeBoer before, and his track record, he's been a high level offensive line coach, but we'll just have to see. It's going to be different. I don't know how much you can apply the Washington Joe Moore Award situation to what Alabama has this year. Yes, they have Parker Brailsford, that helps. 2 day 1 or day 2 picks and Tyler Booker or Jaden Roberts, and you just have to see what they have at tackle. If Caden Proctor can play better than he did last year, if Will Conformity can step in at right tackle and look the part, then they're going to be in good shape. But guess what? We'll just have to wait and see.
I think there's a lot to like about this offensive line. The interior obviously has been very good. Very curious to see where Caden Proctor's at. I know I've said that before. Also very curious to just see what happens at right tackle. We can talk about that over and over again. But the numbers, I did not have them in front of me when I was initially spieling this out, but now I do have them in front of me. Kalen DeBoer's offensive lines, again, it's not a one-for-one comparison, but at Fresno in 2021, they gave up 24 sacks in 6 games. The next year, or that was 2020. The next year in 2021, 25 sacks in 13 games. And then at Washington, 19 total sacks allowed over the last 2 seasons. Like, Scott Huff is a wizard. Again, important to note that he is not in Tuscaloosa. Like you mentioned, Mike, it's Chris Kapilovic. Alabama, meanwhile, 41 sacks allowed in 2021, 22 sacks allowed in 2022, and then 49 allowed last year. There was a lot that went into that. The offensive line struggled early in the season. Jalen Milroe obviously maybe held the ball too long, a few too many times, also stepped into sacks. So I felt like 30.5 was a good line to set, because that seems like a definitive improvement from where they were last year, but also still maybe more than what DeBoer's offenses are used to giving up. So how confident do we feel about these guys? Clearly you feel confident if you're taking the under.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things that lead to sacks in the first place, and it can be a combination of things that fix sacks. So I feel like they can reduce that number. I don't know if that means they're allowing, like Georgia last year gave up like very few sacks. Carson Beck was almost never touched. Like, what was their total? Yeah, he had 11 sacks all year, and that includes playing SEC championship game and a bowl game. So they played
14 games?
14 games, 11 sacks in 14 games.
Not bad.
17 attempts. Yeah. I don't know if it'll be that, but I think part of that's Carson Beck as a quarterback. Jalen Milroe's probably going to try to do some more things back there. Like, he has that confidence to hold the ball and run around, and that sometimes leads to bad things happening. So we'll have to see if you can kind of coach some of that out of Milroe, where he knows when to get rid of it, then that number will go down. I just want to say one other thing about the offensive line, that let's not go crazy about whatever we see against Western Kentucky, because I remember, and I just pulled up the story from last year about when they played Middle Tennessee last year, and they're up 28-0. And you have this play where Milroe drops back, and then you have some Middle Tennessee linebacker who's spying him, and Tyler Booker just shoves him right out of the air. And it was all over Twitter. Like, look at this mean, nasty Alabama offensive line just beating people up. And, hey, did you see how much they weigh? They just showed the graphic on ESPN. Caden Proctor gained 12 pounds this offseason. Tyler Booker's up to 350. they're so big, they're massive, they're just going to eat people alive this year. And then a week later against Texas, they got their asses kicked by that Texas defensive line. And then the rest of the year, we're talking about, why is this offensive line not very good? And then this offseason, we're talking about, hey, they're losing weight. How great is it to lose weight? Can people just make up their minds about what they want here? Like, do you want them to gain weight? Do you want them to lose weight? So let's just pump the brakes a little bit on whatever we see against Western Kentucky, and whether this offensive line is back, whether they're mean. Like, go to Wisconsin, go to play Georgia, or play Georgia at home, and we'll talk about it then. But I would just caution against overreactions the first 2 weeks of the season, because I think to some degree that probably happened last year with Middle Tennessee.
Never too high, never too low. We'll see what happens. To the defensive side of the ball, wanted to talk to you about sacks again, because that's not been Alabama's primary goal under Nick Saban. I think the more primary goal is the pressure, right? The pressure stat from Pro Football Focus, getting the quarterback off their platform and really just kind of building up a brick wall of a defense behind them. But sack totals for Alabama the last 3 seasons, they had 39 last year, 38 the year before, 57 the year before that. I believe that was Will Anderson's breakout season. Now you've got Kane Womack at defensive coordinator. More of a swarm defense. We're going to keep everything in front of us. We're going to be aggressive on the ball when it's in the air. His sack totals the last 3 years at South Alabama, 27, 28, 32. If I said Alabama's sack total at 30.5, you going over or under?
Under. I'll take the under on that. I sound like Nick Saban, but like, sacks are not always the end-all be-all for a defense. If you're affecting the quarterback, if you're doing different things to get in his face, bat down passes, like, you kind of have to broaden the scope a little bit. But it goes back to the conversation we've had 20 different times now, that I don't know if they have a bunch of pass rushers. I would be confident, or at least one that would be confident in just winning those matchups when they need to. And we'll have to see how much Kane Womack wants to blitz and really get aggressive. If he feels like he's trying to cover up for them having mediocre pass rushers, then maybe he tries to blitz, but he's also trying to protect some younger defensive backs that he has. It's going to be a little bit of a gamble, play to play, or at least, a decision on what he's wanting to do. I would take the under. I don't know if that means that they're just going to allow quarterbacks to sit back all day. I think they can probably do some things to affect it. But in terms of getting home that many times, I don't know if I see it from Jamarian Latham and Quandarius Robinson, or even Keanu Cott. I mean, maybe LT Overton continues to come on, and he's that sort of player. But 30 is a big number to me.
We've heard from DeBoer and Womack throughout fall camp that the Wolf guys are creating a steady, consistent pressure. The scrimmage last Saturday, the second close scrimmage, sounded like the defense was able to get home quite a bit. You wrote the story about LT Overton. He was very, very good as a true freshman at A&M. Felt like he was misused a little bit near the end of that season, as well as the sophomore season, which is why now he's here. Womack likes both Overton and Latham as those ass kickers at the bandit position. Tim Keenan is a guy who provided some pressure through the interior. Jaheim Otis is going to be healthy this year. What more can he do to at least draw double teams or just wreak havoc and open up opportunities for other guys? Again, I think we're all in the agreement that there's not a game wrecker within this pass rush, but I think there's a lot of guys that can do a lot of stuff. And maybe these numbers do get bolstered by the fact that they play Mercer and South Florida and Western Kentucky, and a team like Wisconsin's going to throw the ball around the yard. So they're going to have more opportunities, pin their ears back and go. There's a lot of guys here who can do a lot of good things, even if there's not one guy who can do a lot of great things consistency. And so I wonder if it's just the sum of the thing creates enough pressure to be more disruptive, as opposed to just having one guy that can take over a game. I don't know. That seemed a little bit rambly, but that was my thought process. Got a couple more here for you. Kane Womack's defense, the swarm defense, they like to keep everything in front of them. They try to avoid big plays, but they're also very aggressive when the ball is in the air. Spot drop coverage, using their eyes to watch the quarterback make plays such as that. The last 3 years at South Alabama, Kane Womack's defenses recorded 13 picks, 13 picks, and 15 picks. Nick Saban's defense at Alabama the last 3 years, 12 interceptions, 7 interceptions, and 15 interceptions. If I set the over-under at 12 and a half interceptions this year for Alabama's defense, you going over or under?
I'll go over. I do think if you put an emphasis on it, there could be opportunities there. And that doesn't seem like a ridiculously high number. That's 1 pick per game. Again, you're playing some offenses that early in the year you could have some chances, that are going to be throwing the ball against you. Damani Jackson, Zabian Brown, you had Malachi Moore. I don't know if Keon Sabb's going to be picking off too many passes in his role, but I think you got some guys back there that could do it. And
Sabb will kind of play that center field role, right? So in theory, yes, but probably more on like deep shots down the field when he's just like helping bracket a receiver or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know if he's going to be jumping, routes, 10 yards, 5-10 yards past the line of scrimmage and getting picks that way. But, it's doable. It's a good over-under because I would put them probably in the 12 or 13 range. That's basically 1 a game, I think is a reasonable number to expect. And if you get, an extra one here or there that pushes you up to 14, 15, if you have some games where you're just kind of in a drought, then maybe you're down closer to 10. But I would put them right in the 12, 13 range. And for the sake of this exercise, I'll go with the over and say 13.
Who do you think is Alabama's leader in reception or interceptions this season?
I'll go simple and say Damani because he's going to be on the field. And if they rotate Deshaun Jones and Zabian Brown at first, then maybe that limits their opportunities a little bit. But I think Damani is an every down player. I think if you look at the snap counts at the end of the year, assuming he stays healthy, he's probably going to be playing 99% of the snaps. So that would be the player I would stick with.
I think that's fair. And it wouldn't shock me if
just say for a second, 99% of the snaps in games that matter. Like I should say that he's probably not going to be playing 99% of the snaps against Mercer, but when they're out there, as a first team defense, I think he's going to be out there every play.
Yeah. And I think that quarterbacks, offensive coordinators, you look at who they're playing the first 3, their first 4 games, literally a bunch of quarterbacks / offenses that will throw the ball around the yard a little bit, or at least quarterbacks that show a level of competence that will test this secondary. I think it's going to be, I think we're all of the belief that Zabian Brown will probably be the day 1 starter at cornerback 2 opposite of Damani Jackson, or at least he's in line to do that, or at least play significant snaps. It would not surprise me at all, especially early in the season, if he gets tested quite a bit. I think the same could also be said for Damani Jackson, just depending on who, lines up where, because he, struggled a little bit at USC last year. He showed some flashes, but he gives up his fair share of catches, right? So I'm curious to say, I feel like they're going to go after the freshman or the younger guy or Deshaun Jones, whoever is in that CB2 role a little bit more often. But I feel like Damani will also be tested just as frequently, if only because the offenses that they're playing, Western Kentucky is going to throw the ball around the yard. Byron Brown is a very talented quarterback, and Alex Golish is a very good play caller. You mentioned Wisconsin with Tyler Van Dyke in the air raid. So, and then obviously Carson Beck, he's going to be a different level of quarterback than even those first 3 guys. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like the secondary, especially early in the season, until they settle in and prove it, all those guys are going to be tested no matter who's on the field. They're going to get picked on. They're going to get tested. And so it's kind of up to them to be like, yeah, no, quit throwing this way. So we'll see if that happens. But I also feel like over, just because Kane Womack was able to get, he was able to hit the over each of his last 3 years at South Alabama. And now, even in his words, he's got better athletes than he's ever had. In theory, they should be able to execute his defense at a higher level, and that should lead to a greater output. At least that's one line of thinking. We'll see what happens. I feel like we've been saying that a lot this show. Maybe that should be the title. We'll see what happens.
I concur.
Last one for you, Mike. Alabama was one of 44 schools to return a punt for a touchdown during the 2023 season. The tides came when Caleb Downs took a punt back 85 yards for a score in what was ultimately a 66-10 win over Chattanooga in November. Thanks to that punt return touchdown, Alabama has now scored at least one punt return touchdown every year since 2018. No other school has done that. It is the current longest active streak in the country. Do they do it again this season? And if so, who?
Where did you find that stat?
Don't worry about it.
That's kind of a random stat. I would hope
we got to end with special teams.
Right. Well, it's just like, it'd be hard to look that up, but I would say No.
Ooh.
But I don't know. Like, I think if it happens, it's probably going to be against Mercer or Western Kentucky or South Florida. Like, big special teams plays tend to happen against those teams where you just have better athletes on the field across the board. Jameson Williams returning 2 kickoffs against Southern Miss a couple years ago for touchdowns in the same game. Like, never did it again the rest of the year, but like, he was the fastest guy in the field by far in that game. It depends. If they have Cole Adams back there as Mr. Reliable hands on their punt unit, which we saw that open practice that we watched, then, I don't know if Cole Adams is going to be bringing back too many for touchdowns. Even Jeremy Bernard, like, I don't know if he's really the fastest guy in the field either. So I would lean towards no, but just kind of depends on who's out there and what kind of breaks ahead of them. And I want to say those are fluky plays, but like, you can't really predict when those are going to happen necessarily.
You kind of can. You ready for this?
Okay.
So in 2018, they returned 1 punt for a touchdown. It was against Louisiana Lafayette. In 2019, they returned 3 punts for touchdowns against Ole Miss, A&M, and LSU, surprisingly. But then you get to 2020, they returned a punt against Arkansas. In 2021, they returned 2 punts for touchdowns against Mercer and Texas A&M. 2022, they returned 2 punts for touchdowns, both of them against Louisiana Monroe. And then last year, they did it against Chattanooga. The odds are very, very good that they do it against their FCS opponent. Sorry, Mercer. That just seems to be the thing that happens.
Right. But if it's Cole Adams back there, is Cole Adams going to outrun Mercer players? I don't know. I don't know if that's, hey, SEC added rowing. Wow.
Let's go.
Yeah. I didn't know we're in the age of adding sports to conferences, but that just got put out by the SEC that it's going to be their 22nd sport they sponsor. So there you go. We go from Cole Adams to SEC rowing.
To be fair to Cole Adams, again, I've been playing the EA college football game a lot. I didn't take a punt back with Cole Adams, but I did take a kickoff back with Cole Adams. Okay. So if the game is any bit as realistic as the developers hope it is, Cole Adams has the speed to take some sort of special teams return back for a touchdown. And it would be kind of cool if it was a punt. I personally think it would probably be some combination of Kendrick Law, Ryan Williams, or Jalen Mbakwe, just because they seem to be a little bit more fluid athletes. It can hit the gas a little bit faster than a Cole Adams can. But if you're going to return a punt for a touchdown against Mercer, I'd like to think that maybe widens the umbrella as to who could potentially do it, which means Cole Adams is probably an option. One man's opinion.
I agree.
That's my thought. That's all we've got today. I thought that was kind of a fun discussion. Clearly, we're ready to watch some games. We're going to have one more, I guess, technically 2 more preview shows coming up next week. One of them, though, the big one, Rodak, Scarborough, and I are each going to go through our game-by-game predictions for the 2024 season. You're not going to want to miss that. We're going to do that tentatively early next week, and then we'll come back later in the week to preview Alabama's Week 1 game against Western Kentucky, some of the things that we're looking to see, what do we want to learn, things of that nature, as if any of the shows that have led up to this point already have not outlined what we want to see from Alabama this upcoming season. But yeah, that's all we've got today. We'll be back sometime next week. In the meantime, be sure to rate and review the show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 24/7 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 24/7 and 24/7 Sports. You can get 30% off an annual VIP membership, which is a year's worth of Bama 24/7 and 24/7 Sports for less than $10. You guys should absolutely take advantage of that, especially if you're an Alabama fan. As always, we appreciate you guys for listening. We'll talk to you all again soon.